We've seen buildings that are steel, skyscrapers that have burned for days and have never fallen down. And if there is some structural failure, it will kind of topple. It won't go right down into its footprint immediately. And then it happened twice. And then it happened a third time, and that one wasn't hit by a plane. And then it happened with the BBC standing there telling us that it already collapsed with the thing over their shoulder. That's where they wind up going. When I saw that from the BBC, I said they're going to come in and try to explain that. I've had Tony Rook from the UK who did a documentary about it from the perspective of firefighters, saying why, if this is now a possibility, because this has never happened before or now since, if this is a possibility that steel skyscrapers can just collapse in their footprint after only an hour or so of burning, we need to change the way that we fight fires. The memo is going to be coming out, released imminently by President Trump. We've got people coming out of the woodwork, people like Leon Panetta, that we haven't heard from for a while. Remember Leon Panetta, who was a congressman? Then he was, I think he was first Defense Department head, then he became head of the CIA. I think it was that order. But he's been both of those. And when he was in 2012 as Secretary of Defense, now Attorney General Sessions, who was Senator Sessions at the time, had a very interesting discussion with Leon Panetta over how what he would do in terms of things like creating a no-fly zone in Syria. Would he go to Congress to get their permission as Secretary of Defense, or would he just do it? And so there was this very interesting back and forth. We're going to play that again for you today because Leon Panetta is saying that if this memo comes out, and if there's any kind of revelation, if they don't redact all the names, or if the FBI and the Department of Justice people don't like this, in other words, if Rod Rosenstein takes offense to the fact that perhaps his name is most likely in there, then this is going to create a constitutional crisis, says Leon Panetta. He doesn't think it's a constitutional crisis if he goes to the United Nations to get the permission for war and ignores Congress. You remember when they went back and forth, he said, yeah, we'll probably tell you about it, but we would go to the United Nations for authorization to go to war. That's not a constitutional crisis. If the president releases a memo without the approval of his subordinates, because that's what we're talking about here, the Department of Justice and the FBI are his subordinates. And if they go to, if he releases that without the permission of his subordinates, then that is a constitutional crisis. Maybe it is a crisis for the deep state, because I guess these guys in the FBI and the Department of Justice are there to keep tabs on the president. So we're going to take a look at that. We're going to take a look at how they are spinning this now to isolate and attack Devin Nunes, and some very interesting comments on this whole process and the holding up of the memo until after the reauthorization and loosening of controls on the FISA court on the surveillance state that was done by the House. I'm glad to see that Judge Napolitano is talking about this. This is very important. This is something I've been talking about for quite a while. I think that is the biggest news. I think that's bigger than the memo, quite frankly, because what that shows us is the bipartisan nature of the deep state. Something is rigged about this system when they withhold that information from the House at large and reauthorize this, even loosening the restrictions after all this information that showed how the law has been violated by the NSA and others, still allowing that to go ahead. William Binney was very upset about that. That's why he came on and talked about that with Alex Jones. And it is very, very important. If they are unwilling or unable, if they truly were absolutely ignorant of what is going on with this, then they are unable to oversee the NSA. A good example of this is what I talked about briefly yesterday with the BBC, saying, there's still people who think that 9/11 might have been an inside job, quote unquote, inside job. And they bring this up to discredit people who are really paying attention, but also paying attention to the BBC's role in all of this. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because my wife even missed what I had to say about that yesterday because I covered it so briefly. But also, what you see here with a NBC TV program, Law and Order, SVU. I've never watched this. I don't watch this kind of stuff. I don't waste my time on it. But this is the other way that they control the agenda. So you have the Hollywood entertainment way to do this. You have the direct attack, the didactic attack, if you will, of the BBC, the visceral attacks of melodramas, who put people in roles to project and to change the way that you feel about certain organizations, even calling this episode InfoWars, where they have a female reporter going to an Antifa they call it alt-right, but it's neo-Nazis who are fighting each other in the streets. InfoWars reporter goes there to report this. Of course, they don't call her an InfoWars reporter, but that's just the name of the episode. Hint, hint. She gets raped. It appears it's an Antifa guy and not a white supremacist. But then, just when you thought they were even going to maybe have a little bit of honesty and portray the Antifa people as violent, no, they kind of spin it away to make one of the white supremacists the rapists. Because that's the way these guys ultimately operate, right? Are they banning news organizations because they want a monopoly on the news? Well, of course. And the same thing is going to happen with cryptocurrency. You can bet that it will. They're going to set up some kind of a payment system, probably like PayPal. And this is something that's been going on for a very long time. When we look at these attacks from NBC, these attacks from Facebook, these attacks from BBC, understand that the CIA had their own domestic operation here, Operation Mockingbird, where they had a great deal of involvement with the major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC. Of course, the government runs NPR. But there's also been 70 years of disinformation of magazines in Europe. The CIA has been funding magazines in Europe. And, of course, the CIA and In-Q-Tel and DARPA, you can take a look at how they got their start, how Facebook and Google, many of these social media de facto monopolies, how did they get their start? Well, in some cases, they had direct investments from the venture capital firm for the CIA, In-Q-Tel. That's no secret that they have a venture capital firm. In many cases, they had people sitting on their board that were former DARPA people, sitting on the board of In-Q-Tel, getting money from either In-Q-Tel or getting vast sums of money from one person who is one level indirect from In-Q-Tel, with people sitting on his board. For example, Excel put in $12.7 million into Facebook, but then they talk about the fact that Peter Thiel put in $500,000, and they made him the visible supporter and funder of Facebook, if you look at the movie version of the way this is put through. So they have this complete spectrum of disinformation, from social media to mainstream old-line media like the BBC, to NBC News, putting out these types of information. And we go back and look at the BBC, saying, look at some of these people were saying, look, just immediately after this, did you notice that this thing fell down completely? This building fell down completely in its footprint? That can't happen. That would never happen. We've seen buildings that are steel, skyscrapers that have burned for days and have never fallen down. And if there is some structural failure, it will kind of topple. It won't go right down into its footprint immediately. And then it happened twice. And then it happened a third time, and that one wasn't hit by a plane. And then it happened with the BBC standing there telling us that it already collapsed with the thing over their shoulder. That's where they wind up going. When I saw that from the BBC, I said, they're going to come in and try to explain that. I've had Tony Rook from the UK, who did a documentary about it from the perspective of firefighters, saying, why, if this is now a possibility, because this has never happened before or now since, if this is a possibility that steel skyscrapers can just collapse in their footprint after only an hour or so of burning, we need to change the way that we fight fires.